Hello, welcome to Game Dev London. Today with me is Olly Rippon of Staffordshire University, London. And we are going to be talking about, as people are coming off the global game jam and the dust settles from various projects, we're going to be discussing scope and why it's so hard to fit a game into a long weekend. So I think we're going to call this one, What is Scope and Why is it so creepy? Olly, would you like to just introduce yourself first? And oops, I've knocked a VR headset off my desk. Would you like to introduce yourself and give listeners a little background?
Yeah, of course. So, hi, gang. I'm Olly. I'm a lecturer at Staffordshire University, London. That's one of our, it's our like satellite campus. We kind of focus more on game stuff down there. So I've kind of been working with games in some fashion for, I'd say actually it's coming up on like 10 years when I started getting into it as like a hobby. And now I've been teaching for about 3 years. So I've done games for a hot minute.
Brilliant. And you've obviously your students have a whole bunch of projects that they need to sort of like fit into their terms. So
Yeah. There's a lot of, as a student and as a former student, that idea of kind of being able to scope projects is always invaluable. Being able to know what you can actually fit into a certain amount of time. It's one that admittedly I'm still trying to figure out for myself.
So am I after 30 years. But what about what is the particular difficulty with trying to pack like a game into like a long weekend, for example?
For me, it tends to come down to a little bit of time management, like just being able to figure out like when you can do certain things and how long different elements of a game are actually going to take you to develop. A lot of the time, I tend to find that I underestimate how long things are actually going to take. And that's sort of the pattern that I tend to see quite a bit is people will think like, oh yeah, I'm going to make such and such game and it's going to be huge and it's going to be great and it's going to have all of these fun things. And they get maybe 2 of those things in.
Yes. Guilty as charged.
Yeah, same. I've definitely done it this year already with a lot of projects. It is kind of it is a tricky one, I think, and it takes a while to kind of figure out what things you do find quite easy to do and what things you think like, oh yeah, no, that is actually going to take a long time. Actually, there's a nice little anecdote that I always got told about scope. It's the like Star Trek Scotty idea where you assume that something is going to take like twice as long as you initially think it will. And then you end up delivering it slightly earlier and you look really good doing it.
Yeah. It's one I can never bring myself to do because I guess that the problem is that a lot of the reason that things take longer than expected is because you get surprised by unexpected issues and so on. And by definition, things that surprise you are not things that you can plan for. So you just have to leave that bit of contingency that feels like you're like allocating some like empty space that you don't actually need because you don't know what's going to fill that space.
Definitely.
It's very hard to force yourself to take an estimate and then just go sort of like, yeah, okay, let's double that then. It's I guess some people are disciplined enough to manage it, but I'm an incorrigible optimist and always assume that everything will go silky smooth. Nothing will ever be unexpected.
I always end up being I'm simultaneously actually the person in our game jam team who is always like, oh, look, this is like a really ridiculous idea, let's do it, let's just try it. And also then the person who someone else will say something that is ridiculous and out of scope, and I'll be like, no, we can't do that though.
I guess it depends how excited you are about the idea.
Yeah, definitely.
To a certain
It's
extent.
always, if I've just started figuring out how to do a thing, I always want to try and implement it in a really short space of time to try and do it that quickly.
Yeah. So how do you get a group of students to understand what is manageable in the time that they have available for it? Because obviously, for a game jam, it's not a big deal if you run out of time and the game's not fully finished. But for a student, they need to tackle something that they can finish and they can get the full experience of completing the project, rather than something that they have to give up on halfway.
Yeah, for sure. I like to kind of just sit down with them near the beginning of the project, like as they're kind of designing everything and figuring out what they actually want to do. 90% of the time that does end up being do you really think that you're going to make an RPG in 4 months?
Yeah.
Really? Most of the time, actually, surprisingly enough, this year, I think most of them have actually been really well scoped. There's been a little bit of creep every now and then, as there always is. But it's kind of, for me, it's a case of reminding them what they already know, like what kind of skills they've already got. And I like to kind of just be like, and remember how long that took you to figure out. You also have to have to do all of that in practice and figure out a bunch of other stuff. There's a bit of a balance, and most of the time that is kind of, I guess, like the realization of, oh yeah, I'm here to learn a bunch of new skills, as well as kind of shore up the stuff I already have, which most of the time, again, they manage to kind of scope it relatively well.
Great. So in terms of student projects, they're not always working alone, are they? So is there a benefit? The optimal way to do it would be to have every student do the thing that they are most experienced doing and have the best idea how long it's going to take on the team. Is that the way you would try to structure a team, or would you try to have the students in roles that they're not so familiar with, so that they can build up their experience in that particular field?
We do kind of, I think we do kind of focus them more into, this is what you enjoy and what you're good at, so go do more of that. I do occasionally get people that are kind of like, oh, I've never done this before, so I want to try it. Or I'm not as good at this. I'm like a bunch of people who are kind of like, I'm not great at animating, so I'm going to figure out how to do animation, for example.
Yeah.
And I guess at that point, I kind of think that you want to set very clear goals of what do you actually want to get out of trying that discipline. If you're more like a programmer and you want to go into try some 3D art stuff, what do you think you're missing already that you want to go and try that? And then what kinds of things do you think that project is going to show at the end of it to prove that actually that was worth the time? And I guess that kind of ties back into how to actually scope correctly, is just give yourself a clear outline of what it's going to look like at the end.
Yeah.
And I guess figure out what, kind of rambling a little bit to try and find the point I started. I guess it's a case of looking at the goals that you've got and figuring out the most approachable way to achieve those goals.
Yeah, because you're trying to learn skills and
Yeah.
like develop experience with teamwork and so on. So with regards to game jams, though, obviously there's a whole bunch of scope that tends to get immediately discarded with game jams in terms of quality of life features that a finished game you would expect to have, but not necessarily a game jam. Like, so save games, for example.
Yeah.
You generally wouldn't expect to need to save your game halfway through something that only took a weekend to make.
Yeah, because in theory, the actual jam game itself, you're only really going to have like 5 or 10 minutes of gameplay in there.
Probably. I mean, I guess it depends on what, unless you make like a procedural infinite runner or something.
Yeah.
But yeah,
that's an idea.
That's a good example of one where like a design that like transforms into like a lot of gameplay for
a short
amount of work. But there's other features that you would generally drop for a game jam, such as achievements and localization, some like accessibility like options for sort of things like inverting the mouse direction or stuff like that. Having an options screen, I mean, just generally having a pause screen is an amount of work that you generally don't want to faff with in a game jam. So if all of those things are cut out and you're just trying to like work on like the core game loop, so that you've got a win and a lose condition, what can you do to try to like keep that manageable? Because obviously people want to make the games that they enjoy playing at home, which often have been labored over for many years.
I tend to you kind of want to look at, I guess, like the main, like the core design pillars, kind of, or the academic in me is desperate clawing out here. If you think about like the way that a lot of those games at home are developed, and obviously you've got more experience in actually making those than I do, it is kind of everything is built up on just a handful, if that, of core design ideas and mechanics. It's kind of stripping away everything else, and the jam prototype is then going to be, here are these core ideas presented in kind of their most bare bones way.
Yeah.
And then I guess taking that and fleshing it out further afterwards.
Yeah.
It's kind of then a case of, okay, so how do we take these individual things and make them interact with each other in more interesting ways, and gradually expand that and make it.
Yeah, you can take one core mechanic and then just sort of like riff on it a bit in a game jam with little tweaks that that can buy you quite a lot of gameplay. So, for example, if your game is about sort of like doing like if you have a springy character who does big jumps, you can potentially like pick up power-ups that make your jumps even bigger. It's a relatively trivial tweak to that core mechanic, but it means that you can then like design levels with like small jumps and bigger jumps, and and then ration out those power-ups to to force exploration and so on.
Yeah, I think Super Hot is actually a really good example of a jam game that did that really, really well. Because obviously, like the actual game itself started as just like I think it was a 7-day game jam project.
Yeah.
And it's just the actual prototype of that is just the movement itself and the cool time mechanics.
Yeah.
And showing off how combat works in that environment. And that's kind of it. there's not a huge amount
Yeah.
of depth to the different like to any different weapons you've got. You've got one gun and that's it.
Yeah.
And it's just, here's a cool scenario for this gameplay, and we'll just kind of show that off a little bit. And then compared to the actual final release of it, tons of different mechanics that will just kind of play on that initial idea a little bit more.
Yeah. That's a really good example, actually, because that also has a very minimalist art style, which is another way that you can reduce the scope to like make it manageable with the flat white environments and the like primary colored red enemies. It's a really striking look, but it can still be polished to look quite nice. With with the ambient occlusion and all the particle effects and so on when you like kill people and they shatter. It's you can take something really simplistic and like make it a feature rather than a limitation.
Yeah, like the amount of polish that it has for what actually amounts to like maybe a handful of extra features is insane.
Yeah, it's great. But the key thing with Superhot is that it's really fun.
Yeah.
And that's another good example, actually, of a game that started as a, as you say, originally it was a jam game, and then it got fleshed out for a full release. So obviously, to take it from like the core jam concept to something that they could actually charge money for, required a bunch of like housekeeping things like save games and achievements and what have you. But also the amount of gameplay. There's a lot more levels in the released Superhot than you could get into a jam game.
Yeah,
for example. So I mean, that level count is like one of the like obvious scope
like
limitations.
The literal scale of the game.
Yeah. Do you find that that's a difficult thing to sort of try to get students to keep it down to just like focus on one level? Don't plan like a dozen levels. Because
I always get the, I'm gonna make like 5 different levels, and I'm like, no, make one, please. I always feel like actually the good, like if you really want to keep the scope of something that small and like show off the mechanics that you've done, make a tutorial level.
Yeah. Tutorial levels take 3 times as long as any other level.
Exactly, which means then you're putting in the amount of work that it would take to make 3 full levels.
Yeah.
So I'm like, it's definitely like a skill in itself to be able to make that kind of environment and that kind of gameplay experience. But I always am a bit like, this is a really easy way for you to just show off a thing that you've made in kind of isolation and show me as the person looking at the work like how it actually functions and what I as a player am going to use it for.
Yes, that's a good example actually of taking a core mechanic and just like making sure that you are like fully showing it off in every way, because you tend to see this in released games as well. So for example, my mind has gone to Portal 2. You've got your core portal mechanic, which they play around with, which you've seen before in Portal 1. And then they start throwing in some of the new stuff into the mix. So the fluid sims with the like slidey and bouncy gels. But and then the fact that you can like spray the gel through portals, and so they will introduce a new mechanic that has a single feature, and then the designers have riffed on that and gone, okay, so we can make a surface bouncy, and you can apply that through a portal. How else can we do it? What other weird and wonderful ways can we use this mechanic? And they've really tried to get every possible use case of combining gel, portals, lasers, what have you.
It's one of those. It's actually something that we're kind of covering with in one of our level design modules at the moment.
Yeah.
Where it's very kind of, instead of just being here, make a level, go, we're trying to kind of look at it from a mechanics perspective. And so how can you take a part of a game and make a level that uses that mechanic in either like an interesting or unique way?
Yeah.
So one thing that I tend to do this anyway for most big quote unquote projects that I'm on, it would be that like the grid of, here are all of the mechanics like in a grid, how can they all interact with each other, and how can then we take those individual things and make interesting puzzles or make interesting environments or scenarios for players.
Yeah, that's a really nice design tool to use, actually, because that ensures that you are going to get the maximum value out of just the 3 or 4 mechanics that you have available to you.
Yeah, I think it also kind of, even rolling it back to just the actual design of the mechanics itself, you start to kind of see, I think, how you can make those mechanics more interesting, and you kind of start to think, this is where the scope creep comes in. You start to think, like, how can I add to that and make that more interesting? Like, what's missing from that to make it interact with this other thing?
Yeah.
And then you need to start thinking about, how easy is that actually going to be to implement?
Yeah, I guess this is one of the reasons why it's very difficult to actually predict it, because you never know when, like, 2 of those mechanics might just naturally interact in a fun way without having to write a single line of code. They just happen to work together, whereas another 2 mechanics might require a whole bunch of additional work to make them function as you would expect them to. So there's quite a wide gulf between something that you like, it just falls out of the earlier work for free, and other things that it's like, well, you would expect this to happen, but actually in order to make that work. So, for example, if you can burn things and then you can throw wooden crates, and then like theoretically you could set fire to a wooden crate and then throw it.
But if you haven't done one
but
correctly, then you can't do the other. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, it means that you've got to support things being sort of like changing state to being on fire, rather than just like changing state to having been burned.
Yeah.
That's a terrible example, but you get the point.
My brain is then immediately going to like Breath of the Wild.
Yes, exactly.
There's just systems on systems on systems that all interact with each other in a way that you think that they should in the real world.
Yeah.
And maybe they all did. Maybe it was just all emergent and everything naturally came together.
Oh, I don't think so.
I doubt it, but maybe.
Not for like Tears of the Kingdom. Some of the crazy stuff you can do in Tears of the Kingdom, I'm sure, took a lot of work to make it behave in what seems like the obvious way. Because, remembering that, like, in video games, even just moving is a mechanic, and just like not falling out of the level is something that takes a bunch of work to make it function correctly. Very little just happens in video games. But once you've got, if you've done movement and you've done not falling out the level, and you've done setting fire to things, then like it follows that you could set fire to something and then push it till it falls somewhere. So it's weird. Sometimes you get things for free, but a tool like that to sort of like force you as a designer to consider those interactions does mean that you're going to make sure that you're not missing any potential clever interactions that you could have run with, and built on stuff. There's quite a few. Do you find that your students tend to have a vision and then go for it, or do they? I guess it's more of a game jam approach to just have like an idea for a core mechanic, get that functioning, and then like see what's fun about it and riff on it to explore the most fun elements.
I think for student projects, a lot of the stuff that I see, and this was kind of true for when I was a student as well, a lot of the things that people end up doing are looking at existing games and taking like individual mechanics from them, and kind of recreating them as learning tools, kind of. So just reverse engineering and recreating it. I think the game jam approach of this is a fun thing that I've got in my head, let's see if it's actually fun. That tends to happen, I think, for more the final year projects. By the time they kind of have a handle on how development works and how 3D modeling works and how texturing works, they start to then kind of see like, okay, I know all of these things. Where can I kind of start pushing the boat out a little bit? And that I think is when we start to see like interesting ideas, and also we start to see like people's habits start to form around that point of like, this is the type of game you like to make.
Right. Once I guess you need to know how to make things to know what you like to make. Which is not necessarily the same thing that you like to play.
That was a very, I don't know about you, like when you had that moment, but I think that was a very like sobering reality for me. Of just like, oh yeah, I really enjoy like playing strategy games and RPGs. I do not enjoy making them.
I can see that. There's building complex interactive systems is complex.
And it was actually like one of the first kind of more creative control projects that I had as a student. I decided to make a little settlement builder in like a year. And as soon as that was done and as soon as it got submitted, I was like, I'm never making a game like that ever again. I will play them forever. I respect people who do like to make those games, because I could not go back.
That's an interesting one, because that's like the polar opposite of the infinite runner that we mentioned before, where the infinite runner is like you're running, you can maybe jump or duck or move left and right, and like obstacles get thrown at you. It's very simple to get that functioning, and then you can just randomize that indefinitely, and then it's just coming up with ways to keep it fresh and add variations and add interest. Whereas a strategy game tends to require all of the core systems to allow all of your units to move around and your buildings to construct over time, and then like perform whatever their function is. And then you need to make sure that like all of them have got a well-designed function that has a good balance, and like every single element, every unit that you can build, every building you can make, every resource that you can harvest needs to be very carefully tuned to be like in balance with everything else. And like, that is so much work.
Just in about 30 seconds summed up my thought process for 9 months.
Okay.
Just that dawning realization.
It's it's well, I mean, but that's general game design for you. It's quite rare to come up with a game design that isn't extremely carefully tuned. So like changing one thing has like a bunch of like knock-ons. Arguably the RPG that you would described before has kind of evolved as one where it's relatively flexible. So like you can mess with your loadout, your weapons, your armor, your like magical buffs and so on, that give you like edges in combat and so on. But a lot of the like a lot of those like design elements, like weapons and magic spells and stuff, will give you like a 5% buff or something like that, which is nice to have, but very unlikely to be game breaking.
Yeah,
because it just makes you that like just a smidge better at something that you could do anyway. The risk, I guess, with something like an RPG is that like if you go around and just sort of rinse the map for everything that you can possibly find, and then build your loadout to maximize like your like arrow range or something like that, then like you can basically like one shot the boss from across the map,
yeah,
because you've exceeded the limits that any of the designers expected you to do. It's But most games, like you say, are very finely tuned, and everything has to be sort of like carefully adjusted to fit within it. And if it's if a building is a little bit too generous with the amount of like a new resource that it generates from two other resources, it throws the entire gameplay loop out of whack. And trying to figure out where it's which of the various links in the process is too generous can be a really hard one. We've kind of drifted away from like game jams there, because that's not something that you would generally be able to balance in a weekend, is it?
yeah. Well, definitely not something I'd recommend trying.
No, there are definitely certain genres
that is from experience. I don't recommend that.
Yeah. So if people have made something that they really think has legs in the global game jam, where should they start with thinking about building it up into a release?
This is going to sound like kind of backwards advice. My instant recommendation is tear it down and do it again.
Yeah.
If
That's fair.
If that prototype is genuinely fun and it's something that you can see yourself playing and other people playing,
yeah,
it's worth starting again and doing it properly. Because I think that the way that people approach game jam development, it is a case of we just need to get this done.
Yeah.
It won't be made perfectly, and it won't be kind of, at least for me, this is definitely true for my team. We won't have thought things out properly, and we won't have considered the impact of certain mechanics on others and gone through the whole process of what that final game actually looks like.
That's actually a really good example of an invisible scope element, which is the robustness of your code and, to a certain extent, your design. So I'm a programmer by trade, and yeah, there's a big difference between just like cobbling something together to get it working, which is in many ways the fun part of doing a game jam.
Yeah.
It's just sort of like being a little bit lazy and just like throwing things together in the easiest possible way. When to do it properly, so that like everything is like nice and solid and robust and nothing breaks, requires lots more like handling of corner cases and fail safes and defensive coding to make sure that if the player does something unexpected, it is not going to break the system.
Sorry, my dog just came in. No, it is absolutely. For me, that is totally the first thing that, and it is part of the fun. It is hacking it all together and just kind of seeing what sticks. Which is why, as soon as it's ready to become a bigger thing, go back and do it properly.
That's really good advice. I don't like it. I'm instinctively recoiling from.
I hate saying that.
Yeah.
But every time we've made a game and thought, yes, this actually would be really fun, people that we've showed it to really enjoy the concept. Every time we've just taken that prototype and tried to build on top of it, but it is like building on sand.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's not sustainable.
Yeah, you need to have all of your core systems built in such a way that they are easy, and also to make them easy to debug, not just like the way that they all work together, but making sure that like two systems that communicate to each other go through a like single clear choke point where you can like just test that the data going between the two systems is sensible, or put breakpoints in to catch when something unusual happens, so that you can like track it down to where did the bad data come from is a game that we have to play all the time.
And most of the time, if you're working on a game that you made in a jam and you haven't started it again, the bad data is coming from when you made it at 2 a.m. on the Sunday.
Yeah, and the bad data
you were sleep deprived and thought that you didn't, and thought that you knew better than well rested you.
And the bad data is getting injected directly into another system which has global variables exposed from somewhere you would never expect. Yes, it just becomes this is why a lot of like coding standards exist, such as having accessors to modify data and stuff like that. That is a really good example of an element that significantly increases your scope that you don't have really for a game jam because of the time constraints. But you do need to have it, not necessarily because it needs to be all elegantly written in order to ship, but you will never get to the point of shipping if it's not elegantly written, so that you can find all of the bugs that get introduced. Writing it properly helps you to get it finished when it's a bigger project.
Just because you know where everything is, and when you start bringing on other people to add their own bits as well, it's nice and easy for them, and they don't need to go through nonsense to get what they want done.
Something that is an issue in commercial game dev, possibly not so much for students, you'll have to tell me, in commercial game dev you can quite often catch yourself out by forgetting how a bit of your own code that you wrote 9 months ago works. It's more common than you might think.
Definitely still an issue for students. I feel like actually it's almost worse, because every now and then you'll learn like how to do a thing for a week, implement it, go away, come back to it 3 months later, and you haven't used that technique since, and so you don't actually remember how it works or why it works. So it's not even like going back and reading a book that you haven't read for months. It's like going back and reading it in a different language.
Yeah. Oof. Yeah. So those sorts of issues can those are issues that you don't generally have in the scope of a jam game, because like everything's fresh in your mind for the duration of the jam.
Yeah.
And you don't really have the opportunity to leave little ticking time bombs for yourself hiding in the code. I mean, it can happen. You can the way that you set up a system on day one might have a flaw in it that doesn't manifest until like day 3, when somebody finds the corner case that was always going to fail.
Yeah.
Uh,
that kind of always comes along with, like, again, it's that thing of if you don't plan it early on, which again is kind of outside of the scope of a jam game anyway, but knowing how certain things are, certain systems are going to end up interacting,
yeah.
That's when those cases kind of come up. So taking that game further, you kind of already plan ahead for those just by having an idea of actually how everything's going to interact.
Yeah, I mean, as with everything, the more experience you have, the more you will be able to anticipate some of these surprises, which is why it's so useful to do game jams.
Yeah,
are there any other like design tips and tricks that you teach your students to help them to avoid some of these pitfalls? Put you on the spot there. Sorry.
This is genuinely like this is one of those questions that 1,000 different actual answers, and I can't think of any of them. I think one that I like to go for, and I kind of use this in my own practice as well, is just asking other people. And it does sound really, really simple, but you'd be surprised at how many people I know just that make games in general, if it's as a hobby or as a job or if they're students, that will try and develop something completely in isolation.
Yes.
Without any kind of outside input or any kind of play testing. Mm-hmm. And it will just be, I made this thing, hand it to somebody finished, and it will be like, no, this is super broken, or this isn't actually really that fun.
Yeah.
It's, again, like one of the simplest things that you can do is just talk to people about the thing that you're making.
Yeah.
And one, be ready to take criticism.
Yeah.
And get good at taking criticism.
Absolutely.
But if somebody tells you that something isn't really super fun to them, they probably mean it.
Yeah.
And they will also probably have a suggestion on how to make it more fun that you might not have thought of before.
They might do. But one of my favorite bits of game dev advice, though, is that like if somebody identifies that something's not fun, then like that's important. You must listen to them. If they tell you what they think would fix it, that's less likely to be the right answer. If they are not intimately familiar with all the systems that contribute to sort of like forming the experience, because sometimes the thing that seems like it's the problem isn't really the problem.
I think that's kind of a good way of kind of figuring that out is if somebody says, this isn't fun, I think you should do this. What they're actually saying is, this isn't fun, something is missing that this would fill the gap of. But realistically, you should kind of try and take the thing that somebody tells you to add, try and figure out actually why do you want that.
Yeah.
If it was suddenly like, oh, this doesn't have I don't know, dodge rolling came to mind for some reason. I've been looking at a lot of Dark Souls recently. Like, this game doesn't have dodge rolling. It's like, okay, why do you particularly want dodge rolling in this? Probably because you think that your character's too slow, or you can't get out of the way of attacks fast enough. Okay, we'll look at that.
Yeah.
And figure out what already exists that we can solve that problem with before we go effectively the nuclear option of adding a new feature.
Yeah, that's always a tricky one. I mean, the example I had in my head was that sort of like, if a weapon seems sort of like too overpowered for its price, there's two fixes to that. You can make it less powerful, or you can make it more expensive, which is solving the same issue from different directions. And I think in the dodge roll case, yeah, if people feel like they want to be able to dodge roll, it's because they want to be able, presumably they want to be able to get out of the way of attacks in the way that like another game allows them to do. But for example, if the game is not about movement and dodging, and it's more about just being a tank and like just like soaking those hits, then maybe it needs a bit. What it actually needs is a little bit more cosmetic juice, and maybe some sort of like feedback mechanism, so that actually getting hit feels satisfying in the same way that like dodging a hit can feel satisfying.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, how people feel about the mechanics that they are performing can be wildly different depending on like the visual, audio, and like other feedback cues that you put around it.
It's actually it's made me think of no, I'm pretty sure this story is true, but it might be one of those that has just kind of circled around the industry a lot and is actually a complete lie. One of the weapons in Call of Duty 3, a bunch of players were complaining that it was really underpowered and nobody was using it. And so they changed the sound effect of it.
Yeah.
And suddenly everybody loved it, and it was super powerful. And funnily enough, the statistics that they had from the players that were using it suddenly shot up, and everybody was doing really well with it because they changed the sound.
That's a key thing to remember, actually. The game does not happen on the screen. It doesn't happen inside the 3D level. It doesn't, and it doesn't happen on the sort of like the paper and pencil design. The game happens in the player's head, and so everything that the game is doing on screen and with audio and stuff like that is contributing to that. And yeah, it's at the end of the day, it's smoke and mirrors, and crafting, like poking at like player psychology to like evince the reaction that you want from your players, so that they will enjoy it. But yeah, it's a bit of a black art. I feel like we've drifted a little bit. Let's wrap up. I mean, scope. It's always a challenge. I bet there's going to be some of the games that have come out of the jam that are outstanding in their sort of like elegant simplicity, in that there's almost no content to them, but they're just so perfectly balanced and tweaked that they're just enormous fun to play. And there's probably some other ones which it's an astonishing how much content they've managed to create in such a short space of time. And these are both like impressive like accomplishments of scope, but geared towards people's different skill sets. Are there any can you think of any ways that like people can try to turn their particular skills to making the most out of the limited scope that a game jam offers.
I think a lot of it comes down to what your expectations are going into it. Because I feel like a lot of the time, people who, like teams and developers that go into a game jam thinking, I'm going to make the next big jam turned commercial success.
Yeah.
They end up massively overscoping because they're trying to make a commercial game. They're skipping the step of just make a cool project. Make one cool thing.
Yeah.
And then, funnily enough, then the people who are like, I'm just going to make one cool thing, end up making one really cool thing that has the potential to turn into a commercial success. I think at that point, it kind of comes down to like taking that one cool thing and I guess taking a step back from it and thinking, what am I able to turn this into?
That's great. I don't really think I have anything to add to that.
Really? Because I barely thought I made any sense to myself.
No, it's cool. I mean, I guess the joy of game jams is trying to it forces you to think at a different scope than you would normally. You're just trying to. It almost forces you to just like focus on just a single mechanic and like see how much mileage you can get out of it.
Yeah. And then when you start to take it into the more larger scale version of it, then you can kind of start to think like, okay, what else would work interacting with this one thing?
Yeah. So yeah, there's a lot, if it works at the scale of a game jam, then it's almost certainly going to be something that could work on a bigger scale with more space to explore, more potentially more mechanics that interact with it, more narrative framing it. There's all sorts of ways to expand on a core mechanic. But brilliant. Okay, so sorry, we've rambled for quite a while. Let's wrap things up.
Yeah.
Olly, do you have any socials you'd like to reference for if people want to like follow up on anything with you?
My personal Twitter is on screen.
It is now.
Yes, fab. It's a lot of vowels. And there's a whole story behind why the handle is what it is. I occasionally post up like some of my own game dev stuff up there, and most of it is actually just going to be reposts and retweets from the Staff's Uni accounts, which you can also go and find. It's at Staff's Uni and at Staff's Uni London. And also I tend to post quite a bit on my LinkedIn at the moment as well. Again, mostly about new courses that are coming up. So if you go onto LinkedIn, you'll probably see this face advertising a new course that we're running in London next year. So if you want to come and learn how to do design and programming, this is what's going to be teaching you for 3 years.
We shall put links to all of those in the show notes on the podcasts for simplicity. And if you've enjoyed this chat, then please come along to gamedev.london, where you can find links to the rest of our podcasts and our Discord channel, where there is more game dev chatter happening. Until next week, thank you for joining us. Thanks very much, Olly.
Thank you.